Hi, we're going to do some practice evaluating trig functions using the unit circle. Okay, so we want to find the values using the unit circle of each of these trig functions of the angles. So I'm going to draw the first quadrant. We need just the first quadrant of the unit circle. We don't need the whole entire thing. So remember, it's on an x and y axis. I'm just going to try to draw a quarter circle. And then this first point down here where we have 0 radians, that coordinate would be 1, 0. And if you go up on the y-axis, which is at pi over 2 radians, that coordinate is at 0, 1. Halfway between 0 and pi over 2 is pi over 4 radians, and that coordinate is root 2 over 2. Down here's pi over 6. This is 1/6 of the way to pi. The coordinate for that is root 3 over 2 and 1/2. And then up here, we have pi over 3, and that coordinate is 1/2 root 3 over 2. We also need to remember that cosine of an angle is the x value of the coordinate using the unit circle. Sine of an angle is the y value, and if we want tangent of an angle, it's y divided by x. Okay, we're going to try sine of 7 pi over 4, number 1. So 7 pi over 4 is not in that first quadrant of the unit circle. We have 0, pi over 6, pi over 4, pi over 3, pi over 2, but not 7 pi over 4. So I need to figure out what reference angle to use. I'm just going to draw a sketch of where 7 pi over 4 would be on the whole unit circle. So we start at 0, all the way around 360 degrees. If we go in a circle is 2 pi. Halfway around is pi. Half of that is pi over 2. And then 3 pi over 2 down here. Okay, so I'm going to count by fourths. So if I just go to here, that's 1/4 of a pi, pi over 4. If I keep going, I get 2/4, which is a half. And then 3/4 would be this angle, 3 pi over 4. And if I keep going 4/4, I get 1 whole pi. I'm going to keep counting. 5/4 would be here, 5 pi over 4. And then 6/4, which is 3 over 2. 7/4, 7 pi over 4, is what I want. So now we're in the fourth quadrant. In the fourth quadrant, the x value is positive and the y value is negative. The reference angle for 7 pi over 4 is here, and that's just pi over 4. So then I can go to the first quadrant and look at pi over 4. Look at that coordinate, and I want sine, which is the y value, which is root 2 over 2. But since I'm in the fourth quadrant, the y value is negative, so I'm going to put negative root 2 over 2, and that's my answer. All right, let's try number 2, cosine of 4 pi over 3. So again, I'm going to sketch where 4 pi over 3 would be. I want to know what quadrant it's in. Here's 0, here's a pi. So I'm going to count by thirds. A third of a pi, which is pi over 3, would be here. And then if I go another third of a pi, that's 2 pi over 3. Another third is 3 pi over 3, that's 1 whole pi. And then 4 pi over 3. So we're down here in the third quadrant. In the third quadrant, the x value is negative and the y value is negative. Okay, the reference angle for 4 pi over 3 is here. That's just a third of a pi. That's pi over 3. So then I'm going to go to my first quadrant, my drawing back on the upper right corner, and go to pi over 3 because that's the reference angle. And cosine is the x value. If I go to that coordinate, the x value for pi over 3 is a half. But since I'm actually at 4 pi over 3, which is the third quadrant, cosine is negative, the x value is negative, so it's actually negative 1/2 for my answer. All right, number 3, tangent of 5 pi over 3. So again, I'm going to figure out what quadrant 5 pi over 3 is. I'm going to do the same thing where I'm going to count by thirds. 1/3, which is pi over 3, 2 pi over 3, 3 pi over 3 is 1 whole pi, 4 pi over 3 was where I was just at for the last problem. 5 pi over 3 is down here. And then if I went all the way around in a circle, I would get 6 pi over 3, which is 2 pi. So 5 pi over 3 is just a little less than that, a third of a pi less than that. So that means that's actually my reference angle is pi over 3 again. So I want tangent, which is, and actually the whole reason we drew where 5 pi over 3 is so we know that the x value is positive and the y value is negative because we're in the fourth quadrant. Okay, so tangent is the y value of the coordinate divided by the x value of the coordinate. So I go to pi over 3 in the first quadrant. The y value is root 3 over 2. And the x value, so divided by the x value, which is a half. And then I want to simplify that. So instead of dividing by a half, I'm going to rewrite this as root 3 over 2 times the reciprocal of 1/2, which is 2 over 1. The 2's are going to cancel out, and we just get root 3. So root 3 over 2 divided by a half is just root 3. But because I was in the fourth quadrant, I want to just double check that if I'm taking a negative divided by a positive, then my answer should actually be negative. So I'm going to put for my answer negative root 3. Number 4, cosine of 0. So 0 was right here, and cosine is the x value. All I have to do is look at the x value at 0, and we get 1. That's it. There's a couple more, so let's go on to number 5. So if I'm looking at my first quadrant over here, the x value was a half at pi over 3. The x value was a half. But it says we want negative 1/2. So I'm going to go back. Okay, number 5. Given that cosine of theta, which is an angle, equals negative 1/2, find all possible values of theta, the angle, where it says 0 is less than theta is less than 2 pi. That means theta is between 0 and 2 pi. It just means on the unit circle. So find all the possible values of theta, find all the angles, basically, where cosine of that angle is negative 1/2. So remember that cosine of an angle is the x value. So we want to think about when is the x value negative 1/2. If I go back to my first quadrant again, that happened at pi over 3. The coordinates for pi over 3 were 1/2 and root 3 over 2. So I know cosine of pi over 3 is 1/2, but it's asking when is it negative 1/2. So when is the x value negative? The x value is negative over here in quadrant 2, and the angle for that, where we would get the same coordinates, would be 2 pi over 3. Cosine is also negative, the x value is also negative down here in the third quadrant. That is 4 pi over 3. I know that's 4 pi over 3 because this is 1 pi over 3, 2 pi over 3, 3 pi over 3 is just 1 whole pi, and then 4 pi over 3. So I'm just counting by thirds, adding a third each time to figure out where that angle is. And then if I kept going, that would be 5 pi over 3. But that's not going to give us negative 1/2. The x value in quadrant 4 is positive. So it's here because these x values, those coordinates would have an x value of negative. This would be negative 1/2 and positive root 3 over 2. The y value is positive. This coordinate would be negative and negative. And then 5 pi over 3 would be positive 1/2 and negative root 3 over 2. So then my answer is going to be these two angles that I circled, 2 pi over 3 and 4 pi over 3. We're basically saying if you take the cosine of 2 pi over 3, you get negative 1/2. And if you take the cosine of 4 pi over 3, you also get negative 1/2. So it says find all possible values in the unit circle. Again, this means just in the unit circle where we get that answer. All right, let's try the last one. We want to fix the error. It says, given that tangent of theta, tangent of an angle is negative root 3, we want to find, again, just all the possible angles on the unit circle where tangent of that angle is negative root 3. And it gives us a solution. We have to fix the error in the solution. It says the angle is pi over 3 and 4 pi over 3. So let's just review real quick that tangent of an angle is the y-coordinate divided by the x-coordinate. And we want to know when do we take the y-coordinate and divide by the x-coordinate, and we get negative root 3. Okay, so I just drew the first quadrant again. I'm just going to try testing points and see when I take the y value and divide by the x value, see if I get at least just root 3, and then we can talk about how we get a negative root 3. So it gives us a solution. I'm going to actually test the first one, the pi over 3. So if I go to pi over 3, which is this angle here, I'm going to try dividing y by x. So I'm going to take root 3, which is the y value, root 3 over 2, and divide by the x value, and see if that gives me what I want, which is root 3. Again, I'm going to worry about the negative later. I just want to see if dividing by that y and x value will give me root 3. So to simplify it, I'm going to take root 3 over 2, and instead of dividing by a half, I change that to multiplying by the reciprocal 2 over 1. The 2's cancel out, and I do get root 3. The problem is it's positive root 3, not negative root 3. So when would the solution be negative? It's not root 3, that's the error. Let's look at the other quadrants and figure out when tangent is negative. So if you're just looking at the first quadrant, tangent's always going to be positive because all of these coordinates are positive. You're dividing by a positive, by another positive. If we look at the second quadrant, the x value is negative, the y value is positive. So that's when we would get a negative answer for tangent. The same coordinate that gives us the same x and y value, or when we divide, we get root 3, is here, which is kind of like the last problem, 2 pi over 3. In the third quadrant, if we were down here, which the same angle that has the same x and y coordinate is 4 pi over 3, but the x value is negative, the y value is negative. If we divided those, we would get a positive root 3. So it's not in the third quadrant, it's this angle in the second quadrant, and it would also be the angle in the fourth quadrant that has the same reference angle of pi over 3, which is 5 pi over 3. Because the x value in the fourth quadrant is positive, the y value is negative, and if we divided those, we would end up getting a negative. So these corresponding, or these angles that have the same reference angle of 5 pi over 3 are 2 pi over 3, 4 pi over 3, and 5 pi over 3, but we want just the ones in the second and fourth quadrant because that is when tangent would be negative, because we would be taking either a positive divided by a negative or a negative divided by a positive. So our answer is not pi over 3 and 4 pi over 3, it's actually 2 pi over 3 and 5 pi over 3.